Quayola, the floor is yours. Quayola is an artist who explores the tensions and balances between opposing forces, reimagining classical aesthetics like landscape painting, sculpture, iconography through the lens of cutting-edge technology. And his works were showcased in Victoria and Albert Museum, Park Avenue, Armour in New York, and Palace de Tokyo in Paris. So, Quayola, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. For me, it's always a great pleasure to be here at Signal in Prague in general. I always meet these like old school friends of mine from this media art circuit, and this kind of led me to this crazy party until like 6 a.m. yesterday night. So you gotta bear with me a little bit that I'm a bit fragile today. You know, that's what I wanted to start with. You know, just a little disclaimer. Can I get my stuff on? So I'm gonna tell you, I guess, a little bit about what I do, and some of the ideas that I work with today really they stuck with me from a long time. And I remember when I was studying fine art, you know, as a kid, like in the mid-90s, we were doing these exercises to kind of analyze paintings, and there's several types of analysis that we used to do, but this sort of compositional analysis really inspired me. Like, there was this idea that you had to look through the painting, like you don't want to be distracted by the iconographic layer. It's almost if you have to look at that thing, you know, with a different pair of eyes to try to understand this very analytical, you know, composition. Sometimes they used to sort of let us flip the painting, so we were less influenced by, you know, what we were seeing. And I guess this idea of looking at something with a very different pair of eyes, it's really at the core of what, you know, I've been doing since then. And I guess if we, you know, fast forward to today, like, you know, 25 years on, we live in a very different world where technology, it's somehow mediating, you know, every aspect of our perception. You know, the way we experience the world is kind of mediated by these systems. So a little bit like, I was fascinated at the time from this strange analysis of paintings, you know, looking at something with different pair of eyes. I kind of continue to do so, and slowly building up in using, you know, newer technologies, in, you know, using these machines almost as an opportunity to look at things in a sort of different way. So I guess on one side you could say that technology, it's a sort of core part of what I do. For me, it's not just a tool, it's a sort of collaborator somehow. But at the same time, I do this, and I do these explorations, but looking at the past, at some kind of historical traditions. And there's a few sort of roots in my work that I explore, and I sort of tend to go back over the years. And the traditional landscape painting, it's really something that I sort of continue to explore, like this idea of confronting nature as a vehicle to discover new aesthetics, you know, the sort of ethos of the Impressionist painter that looks at nature almost as a pretext to develop something new. So somehow part of my work, it's kind of connected to this, to the ethos of the, you know, the painter. I go out there, confront myself with nature, but with very different technological apparatuses. I try to bring with me this kind of sort of different pair of eyes, I guess, to carry out this observation. So on one side, there is this sort of personal lived experience that it's crucial to the process, but at the same time, this is sort of aided by additional machines, additional apparatuses. And I guess, you know, nature becomes some kind of pretext to really discover, you know, a new way of looking at things. So sometimes, you know, I like to go back to places that perhaps have been already topics of, you know, landscape painting. Sometimes they have this kind of historical sort of value, like, for example, this garden in France. And again, I carry out this kind of observation almost as some sort of scientific experiment. So there is, on one side, what I call this sort of data capturing process, where I go and carry out this observation with different type of machines. But then once this data is captured, there is also another sort of layer of observation that I do with additional systems that we might develop in the studio. Sometimes these systems were originally developed for completely different purposes, like what you're seeing here, you know, surveillance systems maybe, to try and decode and understand something completely different. So again, the idea for me of these sort of expeditions, these kind of explorations, it's really sort of crucial to the work. Like the sort of relationship between the lived experience in a specific moment, in a specific place, and the sort of lived experience of this machine that somehow sees something completely different. So one of these, for example, here is like us chasing storms, a bit on the footstep of Turner and the sort of Turner painting. So been waiting for this specific meteorological condition to go and capture some information from this like stormy sea. So you could see here how, you know, the motion of the sea kind of get translated into information, into sort of vectors that provide me some kind of guidelines, you know, of how the waves have been moving. And, you know, beside this really sort of detailed kind of analysis, I'm also very fascinated by the impossibility of machines to really understand the world as we do, you know, as you're seeing now, you know, the kind of struggle of this machine trying to decode what is really a rock and what is the sea. So for me, it's not so much using technology to just replicate something or to look at something better than what I could, but I'm also fascinated in the opposite somehow. So what you saw there, it's essentially what I call the sort of pictorial simulation. It's something I've been working on for quite a while. This idea, this notion of developing a kind of new type of pictorial materiality, simulating something that on one side feels familiar, feels like a painting, but on the other side behaves in a very different way. And for me, this kind of pictorial materiality is a way to document a different type of gesture. It's not a gesture that is related to my human limb, to a brush. It's a sort of algorithmic gesture that can be as expressive, but simply in a very different form. So there is on one side all of this exploration that it's somehow quite ephemeral. I am in a sort of physical space, in a landscape confronting nature, then this is somehow digitized, transformed. I operate in this kind of computational environment. But for me, something really crucial is then a sort of materialization of this again, and the sort of physical manifestation of these processes. And in my work, and what hopefully you will be able to see here on this screen at the end of today, it's the idea of kind of creating these sort of new objects of contemplation, but something that ultimately you relate to as a very physical being, as a very physical experience. So you see that in my work a lot, this kind of really fine line between what is digital and what is physical, and the sort of two things kind of interact, and it's very difficult to draw a line between them. So I experiment with kind of several types of machines, but I want to focus on 1 second on laser scanners. This is like something that I started to experiment with, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And I'm fascinated by these machines as they really were developed with a very different purpose, I guess. They are like high precision measuring systems that are used in sort of engineering. So they're incredibly precise, incredibly powerful, but they're not machines made to create images. Like when you put, an SD card into this machine, when you do a scan, you take it out, and basically it's an Excel sheet of like coordinates. Hundreds of, sometimes, hundreds of millions of these lines and these coordinates. And on one side, they are incredibly precise. You can sort of recreate like this image of a forest. This is a place where I've been. I brought the scanner there. What you see here, it's pretty similar to what I was experiencing. But actually, when you start looking closer, you start noticing a sort of somehow errors or the sort of impossibility of this machine to fully understand this properly. So part of my obsession has been to try and focus into these things that these machines cannot solve, and really focus on this idea of this kind of expressiveness that they bring. It sort of reminds me of these impressionist brushstrokes in the end, where something gets, I guess, less realistic but more expressive. So here you have the documentation of this laser that gets confused, confronting itself with a geometry that is too complex to resolve, So again, I sometimes go back to this idea of these machines, their impossibility to perceive the world as we do, and that, I guess, brings for me an opportunity to discover things. So you could say really that my work is a sort of, everything I do is really like a documentation of a process, a documentation of a kind of gesture that I try to implement. And talking about objects that represent a process, like the idea of an object that sort of embeds the story of its creation, then I guess the apotheosis of these are these unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo from the Renaissance. These are objects that I've been obsessed with over decades somehow. What is really special about these sculptures is that the focus is not on the figure anymore, it's on the articulation of matter itself. They're like objects that document the history of their creation. They document this craft. It's almost if these actions are written onto the stone, and that's what really fascinates me. They're really hybrid objects, like the sort of fine relationship between form and matter, but also a thing that documents something very, very clearly. So I've been obsessing with this. I use the word obsessing because that's what I do pretty much, but I've sort of been experimenting with the idea of, even here in the sort of exploring sculptural traditions, to experiment with different type of gestures to program and simulate sort of material removal from a given geometry. So I guess a little bit as what I do in my landscape painting, there is a sort of object, a subject that could be perhaps an historical sculpture that it is scanned, and then this becomes a sort of starting point of these several analyses and observations that ultimately lead to this kind of algorithms and strategy to remove material surrounding them. So my interest has never been to replicate these historical objects. It's rather exploring the space that surround them and essentially document these kind of gestures that I can imprint onto these spaces. And yes, on one side I work and scan sort of historical objects. Sometimes I also sort of reenact some kind of actions, and there are studies, with a real human form. This is a new project I'm working on with the sort of traditions of Greek or Roman kind of fighting, where I work with like real fighters to sort of reenact some of these moments. And so out of this process, this geometry becomes the sort of starting point of this computational processes, computational simulation. What you see here, it's very different from something that you generate as a 3D model. This is not a 3D model. This is the result of a specific process of carving this digital model. So all of these simulations essentially become instructions for a machine to then perform them in real life, become a sort of guiding tools for these robots. I've been exploring this technology for quite a long time and sort of experimenting in several ways. And I remember, like in the beginning when I was doing my very first sculptures, this kind of test with these robots, about, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago, something like that, working with these blocks of polystyrene, spending like hours and hours, sometimes days, like looking at the robot itself. And I thought that what was really poetic beside, the result was the machine itself. So again, after a while, I sort of managed to buy one of these robots and spend more time with it and started sort of exhibiting the robot itself. So my work on sculpture became some kind of performance, some kind of action. So the idea of this gesture that you can actually see, this documented on the objects, but also it's something expressive that you can see, it became really a sort of focus of this thing I've been doing, I don't know, in the last, many years. And since the beginning, I always had this idea that would be so interesting to actually go back to stone, like all of this process, and then make something in marble. And then somehow my focus kind of took me on this more performative side of things. But finally, after a few years, I managed to create this kind of relationship, this partnership with this historical marble quarry in Carrara. This is the sort of historical place where marble of all of the monuments that we kind of know, in Italy comes from. So there is this sort of also historical kind of quality of this place and what these sort of quarries have generated. And basically started experimenting and sort of figuring out ways to actually be able to use a similar experimental process of using these machines, but carving stone, which is what I'm also doing now. So kind of this brings me back. I'm not quite sure if there are other slides, or maybe not. Okay, but brings me back to this idea, of this kind of fine line between what is digital and what is physical. At some point, somehow strangely, I became a sort of sculptor, but I never touched ever with my hands any of these objects in the end. But although I program every single line of these machines, carving it, there's a sort of total control, there is an expressiveness there, but still it's kind of completely detached from me. So I guess that's also a bit of a commentary reflection of the world that we live in. I mean, my focus and observations of the past, of some of these traditions, are ultimately a way to comment the society of what we actually living through. So thank you. I was actually finished in time. Quite good. And as you know, like severely hangover. So thank you for your patience.